Hey everyone, Nick Larovere here, and welcome to the Don't Suck Video Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about equipment. Specifically, if you're starting out in filmmaking, what camera and lights should you buy? Equipment is definitely a big topic when it comes to filmmaking, and it's a question that a lot of people are going to ask when they start out. And there's definitely this fixation on equipment. Especially if you're starting out and you have your eye on all this really cool stuff and you're looking at, I could do so much with that. And the first question I think you should ask yourself when it comes to buying equipment is whether you should get it at all. I think when you're first starting out, you are learning so much in leaps and bounds that you can really learn a lot with very, very minimal equipment. So the question is, what can you do with that equipment that you couldn't do and learn on with your phone? Like, you have a smartphone at your disposal. Most people have a smartphone that has pretty good camera capabilities. And so what you're doing when you're starting out is learning how to string shots together into sequences, into scenes, into an entire story. So you can learn that and practice that by using the smartphone that you have at your disposal. Now, the way that you can get the most out of that equipment is by downloading an app. So for Apple products and for Android, there's a couple different apps. So you're looking at something like Blackmagic Camera for iPhone, which is free and is a really good app, or ProTake or Filmic Pro for Android. And just go out, write a little script, practice shooting stuff, shoot stuff without dialogue. If you feel like you can't capture that audio, there's nothing wrong with that. Film is a largely visual medium. Of course, audio and dialogue can play a part, but it doesn't have to. So get out there and use what you have at your disposal to learn at first. There's no need to buy a bunch of equipment when you're starting out. However, if you feel like you're at the point where you want to take your skills to the next level and you feel like if you were to go out and film with your iPhone, it's just not adequate. You're not able to now stretch yourself, take things to the next level, learn how to use that equipment and how to use it for storytelling. So using lighting to help enhance your storytelling, using different focal lengths and lenses to help enhance your storytelling, then perhaps it's a good time for you to invest a little money in yourself and invest a little bit in your education and buy some equipment. But what I'd recommend is don't get super fixated on it and just basically get the cheapest thing you can to accomplish your goal. So you should think about what is my goal with buying this equipment? Why exactly am I purchasing this? Is it so I can feel cool, so I can show off my new equipment, so I can, feel like a real filmmaker? Or is it because, hey, I need to learn how to use lenses. I need to learn how to use a real camera. I need to learn lighting, and I can't do that very easily if I don't have the equipment. And I definitely can't do it on my time, when I feel like it. So if that's your rationale, I think that's a good one. Because a basic kit of equipment can take you very far. You really don't need a lot to practice a lot of filmmaking techniques. So moving on from that, let's talk about cameras. So cameras lighting, it's going to be the same way, but there's just so many options out there. And again, I would recommend that you just spend as little as possible. You don't need a 4K camera. You don't need a camera that shoots slow motion. You don't need a camera that does raw this, raw that, ProRes, blah, blah, blah. You don't need a lot of things. What you need is a camera that can do manual focus, manual control, that has a detachable lens. There's certain things, I'll go through a whole list of things and I'll get real specific, but so I'll make my recommendations here. As I like to put it, your first camera really should be like your first car. It's not going to have all the bells and whistles. It's not going to have electric seats and heated seats and all, fancy luxury aspects to it. It's going to be a Honda. It's going to get you from point A to point B. That's what matters. So we'll go over a few different aspects of cameras that I think you should look out for. First is, or think about or consider when you're looking to purchase that camera. So the first thing is you're looking at sensor size. And sensor size, if you're not familiar, is exactly what it sounds like, right? It's the measurement of the actual physical sensor. Typically, the larger the sensor is, the more light sensitive it is, the better in lower light conditions. However, the larger the sensor is, the more expensive lenses are required that will cover that whole sensor size. So the smaller the sensor, the cheaper the lenses tend to be. And the more range you actually get out of those lenses for cheaper. So for example, you might be able to get like a 20 millimeter to 200 millimeter for the same price as like a 24 to 70 millimeter on a full frame lens. And that full frame lens would probably still actually be more expensive, and it won't be close. So that's something to consider. Smaller than full frame. So there's full frame sensors, and then there's APS-C, micro four thirds, super 35, which are similar in size. And those are the ones that I would recommend because, again, the lenses are going to be cheaper. The cameras tend to be cheaper. And most films are actually shot on a sensor of 35, a super 35 equivalent size. So APS-C and micro four thirds and super 35 are pretty similar in size. I believe micro four thirds is closer to super 35. Bottom line is, again, it's going to be cheaper. And again, it's going to have a similar look to what movies are shooting on anyway. So you really don't need a full frame camera. Unless you want to make a jump from we're talking $500 to $1,000 range here. Unless you want to double that, and that's how much you plan on spending, and then double the amount you spend on the lenses, stick to the smaller sensor cameras. So things you want to look for in this first camera that you're buying, and will be annoying to be without these features. So first, I would recommend looking for $500 to $700 range for the body. You're going to look for a used camera body. It can be even well used. That's just cosmetic wear and tear, because it really doesn't matter. Cameras last a really long time when they're taken care of properly. And even cosmetic wear and tear isn't necessarily a representation of how well the camera is going to perform. So maybe don't buy the most beat up thing that you can find, but you can easily find a good condition camera of the type that we're going to talk about in $500 to $700 range. So next, for resolution 1080p is just fine. And actually there's gradations of quality in 1080p in cameras. So you might just think of it as it's just a resolution, but there are levels of quality of that footage that the camera is putting out. For example, a camera that we're going to talk about in a minute is a Canon C100, and that 1080, I've worked with that camera, and that HD footage looks really good compared to another camera. So anyway, that's just something to think about. But 4K is nice, but you really don't need it when you're starting out. Focus assist tools like peaking. So we're going to want to look for, these are really helpful, is do research on the cameras and look and see if they have a focus assist, focus peaking type tool built into the camera, because it's going to be really hard to pixel peep and determine whether something's in focus or not, especially if you're just looking at that tiny little LCD or you're looking through the viewfinder. And the last thing you want is to have out of focus footage, right? So those focus assist tools are going to help you make sure you nail focus when you're really making a minimal investment. You don't have a big monitor to look at, and you're not necessarily using autofocus, probably not. So that is something that I would look for. Okay. Next thing is exposure tools. Exposure tools will help you make sure you don't overexpose the footage and don't underexpose the footage. And everything is in a moderate range. So stuff isn't totally black and clipping to nothingness, and isn't totally white and clipping and you're losing detail in the highlights. So exposure tools are like waveform monitor. That's probably the only one they're going to find on this level of camera. But I would look for that as a feature. No recording time limit. You can easily get away with having a recording time limit with your first camera, because especially with filmmaking, you're usually not doing takes that are longer than 25, 30 minutes. It's usually short takes, right? Like a couple minutes at a time. So it's not as much of a concern. However, it is nice to have. Sometimes you might run into a situation you wish, man, I wish I could just let this thing continue recording and it wouldn't just stop automatically. So on the older DSLRs, that was an issue. I can't remember why. It might have been for overheating control, but they wouldn't allow you to record longer than like 30 minutes at a time. So that might be something that's worth considering. The next thing is having some kind of a log option. So if you don't know what log is short for logarithmic, and it is a mathematical, what I understand, it's a mathematical expression of exposure, like darks and brights in your image. And basically the bottom line is that log footage gives you a little bit more flexibility when you're doing editing and you're coloring and stuff. So it helps you retain more information in your image so that when you go in post, you can mess around with it more and you're less likely to lose highlights and shadows and stuff like that. I hope that makes sense. Anyway, it basically gives you more flexibility. So having log as an option is definitely nice. It's a little more forgiving. It's not necessary when you're starting out, but it's nice to have. The next thing is I would look for a camera with a removable lens, because for, I think, fairly obvious reasons, you're going to want to be able to change out lenses, make your own choice on what lenses that you want to use. And being stuck with a built-in kit lens, that might be fine for a while, but at some point you're going to want to take that thing off, and you're not going to be able to if you buy a camera with an attached lens. So next is simple and intuitive menus. You can learn any camera menu system, right? If you take the time, you sit, you go through the menus, you learn where everything is at. However, it is still a pain. And even when you know a camera system well, if the menus suck, then it's just hard. It just makes things less efficient. It's a pain in the butt to go and fix stuff. If something goes wrong, now you're trying to fumble through the menus and figure out how to deal with it. So especially when you're just focused on learning the fundamentals of how to use your camera at first, the last thing you want is also to deal with annoying and confusing menu systems. You just want to be able to focus on the fundamentals. How do my exposure, ISO, and shutter speed affect each other? You know, when I change this setting, how does that affect how my film is going to look? That's what you really want to be focusing on when you're starting. So having simple, intuitive menus is really nice. So the next thing I would look for is camera batteries with good battery life. So some cameras have their batteries are really tiny, and so the battery dies really quickly, which is a huge pain. So, you don't want to be changing your battery every 30 minutes. Like really a good run time is like an hour and a half. It'd be really nice. 2 hours is awesome. Especially out of an older or smaller cameras, you're probably not going to get that much runtime. Though we'll have one recommendation for you where that's definitely an exception. So yeah, a good runtime is nice. Just do a little online research and you should be able to find people who say how long the battery runtime typically is while recording video. Okay. The next thing I think is, it's not that big of a consideration, but it might be worth thinking about, is whether you see yourself continuing with that particular brand, mostly because of the lens. So the lenses tend to last a really long time, and they're useful far longer than a camera typically is. So if you buy a camera with a particular lens mount, like EF is very versatile. A lot of manufacturers have adapters for this lens to, different camera body systems, different camera systems and brands. So like if you get an EF mounted camera and you get an EF lens, chances are that you'll be able to keep that lens even when you sell the camera, and you can use that lens on other cameras and in the future. So it's just something to think about. It's not that important when you're spending a small amount on your lens, but especially when you start dropping $1,000, $2,000 on a lens, it becomes an important consideration. So another thing that's maybe worth thinking about is whether the footage from that particular brand is forgiving for a beginner. Does it look pretty good right out of camera? Yeah, that's something I would consider. In my opinion, I would say Canon is the best, easiest to work with, looks the best right out of camera with little tweaking. Panasonic is second, I would say. And then Sony is the third. I would say that's more difficult to deal with right out of camera. Though, especially on their older cameras. The newer the camera is, the more Sony has definitely improved their color and it looks good out of the box. But for older cameras, that's a consideration. So, okay. Next thing is I would recommend you always buy used. Don't buy brand new cameras, lights, lenses if you can help it. Generally speaking, like I said before, if they've been taken care of well enough, they're going to last years and years. So unless they've been really beat up, you're basically just getting a discount. I still buy stuff used all the time. This camera that I'm recording on right now is used. I bought it, a used Sony A7R for $700, which was a great deal and totally worth it for me. Okay, so I've gone over all the different things that I would consider when buying my first camera. And it was an interesting exercise just kind of thinking through this again, because it's been a long time since I thought about my first camera. And I think if I were to go back and do it again, I wouldn't buy the camera that I did buy. Just because we spent way too much money. Was it cool to have that camera? Sure. Was it really necessary? Not really. We could have done a lot with a much cheaper camera, and we could have spent that money on something else that would have been more valuable. Like I would have bought more lights or maybe more lenses or something, or just save the money, frankly, or spend it on a project to learn. Bottom line is we spent too much. So yeah, it was interesting to go through all that. So that being said, here are the cameras I would recommend. So I have I have 2 full frame cameras and I have 3 crop sensor cameras that I recommend. So we'll start with the full frame. And I actually don't recommend these as much as the crop sensor ones. Like I said, the lenses are more expensive. Just the cameras tend to be a little more expensive. So Canon 5D Mark II. The Canon 5D is the OG indie filmmaker's camera because it was the first DSLR that... Was it Mark II? I think I'm misspeaking. I think Mark I didn't have video and they added video to Mark II. Bottom line is, it does great photos as well. So you have a great photo camera. And then it also does 1080p video. So there you go. And there's tons of accessories, tons of different things that you can use with the Canon 5D, tons of different lens options, cheaper lenses, more expensive lenses. So really you have a lot of room. And then it's a Canon system. So now you have, if you're going to buy lenses for this camera, you can use those lenses into the future. And more likely than not, you're going to be able to sell the 5D and whatever lenses. If you want to move on, you're going to be able to sell them pretty easily because it's just a popular camera and, Canon stuff is popular. So that's the first one. The second one is the Sony A7S I, the original A7S. Benefits of this one in particular, it records 4K. It'll do frame rates at 1080p up to 120 frames per second. So you get slow-mo capability, which is pretty cool. It's going to be good in low light, and it's got decent functional autofocus that will definitely work for talking head, like locked off shots, dialogue type stuff. I can't guarantee results as far as any kind of moving shots, but it's good as far as talking head stuff. And that's something you're not going to get with the other cameras. So those are the full frame recommendations. And again, these are in the $500 to $700 range. So pretty cheap. So crop sensors, we got the Panasonic GH4, which is a good camera. Again, shoots 4K. So that's a nice benefit. And it's just a solid workhorse of a camera. Canon C100 Mark I or Mark II, it shoots 1080p. So the cool thing about this one is it is a professional camera. So yes, it only does 1080p, but it is a cinema camera. It has lots of professional features. It has a lot of the things I recommended. It has log, it has waveform, it has all the focus assist tools. It has XLR audio inputs. It has a lot of different stuff. And it has a no recording time limit. So it's really going to give you a lot of options. It's also good for recording events as well. And then it's also a Canon system. So it's got the EF mount. So whatever lenses you get for that are going to be pretty versatile. And then there's the Canon Rebel T7 DSLR. You can get that with an 18 to 55 millimeter lens for $470. I think I found that on eBay or maybe Amazon. So that's a fantastic deal. That's probably the cheapest setup on the list. If you just wanted to buy something real quick for $470, you can have a camera where you can learn all the fundamentals of using the camera and do stuff on your films with it. You have a nice zoom lens for a nice range, and I mean, it's dirt cheap practically. So all that being said, if price is your biggest consideration, I'd probably take a look at the Canon Rebel T7. If you're willing to spend a little bit more, then I would take a look at the Canon C100. Depending on what kind of deals you can find on like eBay, you might look at the Mark 1 or the Mark 2. Mark 2 is obviously going to be a little better, but Mark 1 is fine. The Canon C100 was actually my first professional camera. Like, we shot on a Rebel T5i, I think, me and my brother, and then we upgraded the Canon C100. Now, why I said that I wouldn't have bought that camera back then, and if I could do things over again, we would not buy that camera, is because when I bought the camera, which was like, I don't know, 10 years ago, that camera was $5,000. So that's what I mean. $5,000 will buy you a lot now. You can buy a brand new Sony FX3 that has amazing autofocus and buy the newest, greatest Sony zoom lens that has awesome capabilities and looks great and is nice and sharp. And you can get all that for under $5,000 almost. So, I mean, the amount that you can buy, how far your money goes now is just totally different. Like I said, a camera that only shot HD, that only did 24 megabit per second data rate on the HD recording, which is low. Like, by comparison, the 1080 on the Sony A7S III, for example, is like 50 megabits per second. So you're getting double the information, and more information means typically better quality footage because there's just more information there. So yeah, just the amount that you get for your money now is amazing. And like, when I started, gimbals weren't a thing. They didn't exist. So you can get a gimbal and a camera that does autofocus at 4K, 120 frames per second for what we got, a camera that shoots 1080 HD, no autofocus at all. Yeah, it's crazy. So yeah, I would have bought a cheaper camera. Like, we should have got a Canon 5D used or something like that. Though even those were also more expensive back then. So out of this whole list, again, if I were looking for the cheapest option, I would look at the Rebel T7 with a kit lens. And if I'm looking to spend a little bit more money, I'd take a look at the Canon C100. I think that would be a good option. Either of those, honestly, might be kind of hard to sell. I'm not sure. I wouldn't expect a lot of resale value out of them. However, if you're making an investment in your education, your filmmaking growth, it's not, that's probably not as much of a concern. I just want to rant for a second, because the amount of tools that are at your disposal, and the tools that when I started were actually much more expensive, you can get them so much cheaper now because of all the new tech that's coming out. Like, the number of tools and the things that you can do with your dollars and how much they stretch now is crazy. And I love it, because it definitely democratizes things. And now you can do things solo that beforehand would have taken multiple people to do well. So yeah, there were no gimbals. There was no autofocus for video. It was a different world. Were there LEDs? Yeah, there were LEDs, but they were like kind of crappy, like LED panels that you buy from China. Or I guess there were probably some big brands with expensive LEDs, but LEDs were really expensive 10 years ago, and they've become so much more affordable. So this is actually going to play into our talk about lighting, because lighting is very important, and I think overlooked by filmmakers who are starting out. I think there tends to be a fixation on cameras, and I would highly, highly recommend buy a minimal camera, invest into lighting. You don't need to spend a lot of money on the lighting, but focus on the lighting. because you can have an identical camera, two filmmakers using the same camera, even a crappy camera. Like, honestly, you could shoot with a camcorder and two filmmakers, and one can make it look professional, like a film, and the other can make it look like a home video if they don't know what they're doing. And so, yes, it has to do with camera, and it has to do with how you use it and focal lengths and things like that. But a lot of it has to do with lighting, and is what sets one person's film apart from another's in terms of visually how good it is. So really focus in on lighting. You need to learn how to use the camera. You need to learn, how that affects your storytelling. But lighting will set you apart. And frankly, I think lighting is way harder. Like, you can learn camera stuff fairly quickly, but I think it could take a lifetime to really learn how to light well and learn how to control light and where to take it away and where to add it and color contrast and all these different qualities of light. There's a lot. So, bottom line is lighting is very important. So you definitely want to invest into your education and into your lighting equipment. So you have a lot of options now. It can be overwhelming because there's only a few cameras that you're going to be able to afford, but there's like so many different kinds of lights. I remember when I started, I went to film school for like a semester, and they were showing us all these different lights, and I'm just like, what are all these different lights for? There's so many different options. And I'm like, okay, there's like 10 different kinds of tungsten lights alone. And I'm like, oh, that's a tungsten soft light. That's a tungsten baby Fresnel. That's a baby. That's like this, all these different names. And I'm like, okay, so that looks slightly bigger, but it's the same brightness. It's a 2K, 2000 watt light, and that's a 2000 watt light. And like, what's the difference? Why would I use that one and not that one? And then there's fluorescent lights, and there's different kind of fluorescent lights and different sizes, and there's soft boxes, and there's hard lights, and there's soft lights, and yada, yada, yada. Right. I could go on, and I will in a second. But, anyway, I'm just saying, I know it can be overwhelming because there's so many different kinds of lights. So what I'm going to do is try and describe a few different options for lights that will give you a versatile lighting kit and give you different options. You're going to basically have to make some choices here. But I'm going to explain what the lights are, what they're good at, what they're not good at, and so hopefully help you understand why you might want to pick that light. So I would get a small versatile kit. You want to get a few options that give you flexibility. I would say you should not expect to compete with the sun. So you're not going to probably be able to get lights powerful enough to compete with the sun. And so what happens on a lower budget project is you are going to work with the sun. You're going to work with your existing lighting and enhance what's already there, because you're just not going to have the money to buy the lighting units that are going to be powerful enough for you to compete with outdoor lights, or to simulate them. Like, you're really not going to be able to simulate the sun coming in through a window, for example, if you don't have powerful enough lights. And it's just a simple fact. It is what it is. So like I said, you're going to be working on enhancing the existing lighting conditions, working with practical lights, working with the sunlight that you have available to make the best image that you can. I hope that I'm not rambling too much here, but it is a lot to go over. Where would I look for equipment? I would look for used lights that are on Facebook Marketplace, ShareGrid used, particular for lighting. I would look in Facebook groups, look for gaffing or like used lighting in LA type groups on Facebook. And you're going to have a lot of professionals who are actively selling their old equipment. You have studios, you have small production companies and individuals. They're trying to get rid of their equipment so they can upgrade to other stuff. And so that's when you can, if you watch and wait, you can really snag some awesome deals. Another place to look for is, let's see, what are they called? Wooden nickel lighting. If you go online, look up woodennickellighting.com. It is a rental house and I believe they also do sales of new equipment. But they have a constantly updating list of used lighting and power, electrical, and distro equipment. You could get some really good deals on there. So I think you have to pick it up in LA. I'm not sure if they ship, but anyway, I just want to put out there that is an option. Okay, so let's talk about different types of light here. So we have LEDs, we have fluorescent lights, and we have tungsten lights. There is also a fourth category. There's HMI, but I'm not going to talk about HMI because generally speaking, if you're a beginner, I would not recommend messing around with HMI lights. They tend to be much more expensive. They're a little more volatile, take a little more expertise to work with. They're more dangerous. And if something goes wrong, you're more likely to get hurt, burned, pop a bulb, and the bulb is like hundreds of dollars. So just don't mess with that at first. You really don't need it. So we're talking about LED, fluorescent, or tungsten. And we're talking about hard lights and soft lights. So let me get into it. I'll start with LED. So there's a lot of LED stuff on the market now. Obviously, LED is huge. And what has happened is as LEDs have become more popular and more affordable, a lot of people have been upgrading and switching over to LED, if not in whole, at least in part. And so what happens is all the prices for fluorescent and tungsten stuff has dropped significantly. So now stuff that cost way more a few years ago, you're going to be able to get a great deal. So that is great for you. So generally, I would say from most power, most light output to least output for your price, tungsten is going to be the number one. You will get the most light output for the cheapest price. You can get a 2,000 watt, very bright tungsten light for a couple $100. You can get these lights very inexpensively. There are some drawbacks, however, which I'll get into. And then I would say LED is in the middle, generally pretty cost effective in terms of amount of light output for the cost. And then fluorescent is lowest output, but that's because fluorescents are naturally a soft light. So they're not projecting a hard beam of light. So they're not designed for getting maximum lighting into a room, right? That's just not what they're for. So they tend to be fairly inexpensive, but also lower output. But that's part of the design, and I'll get into that. So let's start with LEDs. So LEDs are way cheaper than they used to be. And generally speaking, the power output, the light output for the cost is awesome. They tend to be very versatile. So they're dimmable built in, which is nice. A lot of them are bicolor, so they can be turned to daylight. They can be switched to tungsten in gradations, and they're lightweight and they don't get very hot. So they don't add a lot of heat to your room when you're filming, and they're relatively sturdy. However, I would say at the price point that we're talking about, which is like under $500 for a lighting fixture, because what I'm trying to do is give you ideas for a kit that you could build for like under $1,000, like maybe $750. So at that price point, you're not going to get a super powerful LED light because, again, like I said, tungsten is much brighter for the same price. Tungsten lights are not expensive. So just basically, if you're going for an LED light, what you're picking is a light that's going to be versatile and flexible member of your lighting kit. You're going to be able to do a lot of different things with it. It's just not going to be the brightest. It's not going to be the best at everything, if that makes sense. Not at this price point. So a few examples of LED options that are in this price range are a couple of hard lights and a panel light. I guess I should talk about hard lights and soft lights. Well, I'll get into that with each category. So Aperture Amaran 200X. This is a point source light. It is a COB LED light that has a circular LED chip. So it is a small source of light, which means it's a hard light, which means it creates harsh shadows, and it's not soft. So that 200X costs $331. It is a bicolor light, so it can do tungsten or daylight, and it's a decent little light. It doesn't, I would say it's pretty flexible and nice little light. Again, you're not going to be overpowering the sun here. You're not be competing for the sun because this is not that bright of a light. You need a much brighter light to start doing that. However, it's great for enhancing what's already there. You can have it through a window to add a little extra. You can bring up the brightness levels of a room by shooting it, up into the ceiling and bouncing it into the room. You can do different things with it. If you're in a darker environment, you can put a softbox on it and have some nice soft lighting. So there's different things that you can do with it. But again, just don't expect to compete with the sun. Next one is another point source, which is a little more inexpensive. That's the Aperture Amaran 200D, which is $263. And this is just the daylight white only version of the last light I've talked about. It's just more inexpensive. The next one is a panel light. It is the Aperture Amaran P60X. That is $169. And I have the color version of this, and it's a great little panel light. It's about this big. You can run it off of battery if you want. You have to get a couple more accessories and get a battery for it, but you can run it off of V-mount battery, which can be nice. And it's bicolor, and it's just a nice little light. It's nice and flat and thin, so you can fit it in more places. And it's already going to be a little softer than a point source light like the Amaran 200X or 200D. And so it's not going to be the brightest light, and it's not going to be the softest light by itself, but it's a little closer to soft. So that can be a benefit. Like, for example, you can put it in a fridge or something and have a light coming out of the fridge, or you can hide it in a closet to add a light coming out of the closet onto a person. Or you can do a lot of things with it. And even it's pretty bright, actually. Even if you're in a dark environment, it'll do a pretty good job. Actually, this light right here, this is the Amaran P60C that I'm lighting this with. So, and I've got a softbox on it, and then I've got an umbrella in front of that, and it does a pretty good job. It's pretty bright for what it is. Okay, so let's talk about fluorescent lights. So fluorescent lights are inexpensive and fragile because they're fluorescent bulbs. However, they are a soft light. They're great at being a soft light, but that's all they're really good at. So they're not going to light up a whole room. Probably they're not going to shoot across the whole room and light somebody because it's just a soft light. However, if you need a nice soft light that you really don't have to do much to for it to look nice, you can put it right up close to someone, or it can, for example, it can help emulate the look of a lamp that's lighting a character in a scene. Or it can help emulate the look of moonlight coming in through a window. Like you could put it outside of a window and emulate moonlight that's already nice and soft and coming in from outside. So there's different things you can do with it, and it's a great light for what it is. It's relatively flat, so you can fit it right up against a wall. You can do different stuff with it. But it is designed for that. That is what it's good at. It's not good at a whole lot else. So that's just something for you to keep in mind. So a specific example, I went and looked on Wood and Nickel Lighting, and they were selling Kino is the brand. Kino 4x4. So that's 4-foot long tubes, 4 tubes in a bank with lights, with the bulbs for $195. And that's a pretty bright light for a soft light. $195 is a really good deal. Let's talk about tungsten lights. So tungsten lights, there's tons of different varieties. They all do different things, slightly different things, greatly different things. Depends on the type. So it can be pretty overwhelming when you're looking at tungsten, in my opinion. So basically, what is a tungsten light? A tungsten light is a light with a bulb that has a tungsten filament. The filament gets very, very hot, and a certain percentage is outputted as light, and the rest, like 80 or 90%, is outputted as waste heat, which is why they get so hot. So you have a light that produces a very bright light. It's hot. It creates hard shadows, which the light can be softened, but naturally creates hard shadows. And then it's stuck at 3200 Kelvin color temperature. So that is probably the biggest consideration here. Remember earlier I said that tungsten lights, they are very bright for the price. They're cheap, very bright. However, the downside is they're 3200 Kelvin. So you have to work around that. So you have to consider that when you're buying your lights is you're either going to need to put a colored gel, a color correction gel on these lights, which means you take the barn doors for the light, you buy these color correction gels, you put like a blue color correction gel over the light to correct that to some extent over to a daylight color. And what happens when you do that is you're going to lose a certain amount of light output from that light. And it's a trade-off. And generally, I would say you still are getting a lot of light out of it if you convert it. And there's different things you can do. You could partially convert it, and you can adjust your color temperature of your camera to be closer to the tungsten so that on your camera it appears to be closer to daylight. There's different tricks. Just going to have to learn to work with it. A lot of situations you can just get away with the tungsten light because in our everyday lives, yes, a lot of things have changed to LEDs and there's white light, but there's a lot of situations where tungsten light is what's called for. Like, for example, if you're going to be doing a scene in a hotel room or a bedroom or a living room, kitchen, a lot of household situations, a lot of those things are still lit with tungsten lights. So you have lamps, you have chandeliers, you have candles, you have lamps. I said lamps, but what I meant there was like a campfire lamp. There's lots of different situations where tungsten is the right color choice for the situation. So there's nothing wrong with tungsten. It's just that it's something you're going to have to work around. And it's one of the reasons why LEDs are so popular, because if you have an LED where you can just change it on the fly without as much light loss in output from daylight to tungsten or back and forth, that's really cool, right? So that's one of the benefits of LEDs, but LEDs are going to be more expensive than tungstens now, generally speaking, if you got to use tungsten light. So tungsten lights are sturdy. You can beat them up. They're going to last a long time and they're bright. The bulbs do get fragile when it's hot, and I wouldn't recommend like leaving the lights. I would recommend putting them in some kind of padded case, because if they get shaken around a lot, those filaments in the bulb will eventually shake loose. So just keep that in mind. And then bulbs are pretty cheap if you need to replace them, but just one tip, if no one's told you this, do not touch the tungsten bulbs with your bare hands. And if you do, get a cloth with get like a microfiber cloth with an alcohol solution, or use an alcohol wipe and wipe that bulb off that you touched, because what happens is the oils from your skin, they get left on the bulb surface, and then when the bulb gets really, really hot when it's in operation, that oil makes a temperature differential on the bulb itself, and it basically warps that area of the bulb. It will cause the bulb to explode. So you might have a bulb that just pops and you're like, what happened? Well, it's probably because somebody touched it. So let me get into specific light recommendations for you now that I've explained a little bit about tungsten lights and specific considerations when you're looking at them. So one light that I might recommend is a Lowell OmniLight 500 watt focus flood. It's $68, which is a great deal. The reason why I'd recommend a light like this is it's small, compact. I mean, literally it's about this big. It's like a little box. It can fit into a lot of places, and it has a nice focus and flood feature. So you can really spot it in and focus it further across the room, or you can flood it out to fill more area. There's a lot of varieties of tungsten lights, so I'm not going to be able to explain all of them, but basically, in this situation where you want to have a small kit that's more versatile, that has fewer lights that maybe do very specific jobs and more lights that let you do a lot of different things, what I'd recommend is harder lights when it comes to tungsten. So the hardest kind of tungsten light is what's called an open face light. And the reason is that open face, the bulb is open to the air. So it's basically a bowl that focuses in the light from the bulb out, versus anything with like a lens in front of it or something. This is the hardest form of a tungsten light because it, the smaller a light source is, so in this case, all you have is the tungsten filament, the harder the light is, the harsher the shadows, the harder the edges. And I won't get into the to everything with that, just understand that the larger a light source is, the softer it is. So when you start putting things in front of a light source and the light is hitting those things, for example, a softbox, this is how a softbox works. So if a small light source is projecting out and hitting a softbox, this big soft white piece of cloth, that cloth becomes the new light source. And so now you're taking this small thing and you're multiplying it by like 10 times, 20 times size, and it becomes softer. So the same principle works with a tungsten Fresnel light. A tungsten Fresnel is a tungsten bulb with that sits in a little cradle. I don't know what to call it. So the tungsten bulb is sitting right here inside the light fixture, and there's a focus knob at the back. There's a focus, a spot, and a flood left and right. And so when you move that knob, the bulb gets closer or further to the tungsten Fresnel lens. The Fresnel lens is this piece of glass with a bunch of ridges on it. It's designed to focus the light and project it further. So anyway, it basically spots or floods the light when it moves in closer or further from the lens. So a Fresnel light, because it has this lens, which becomes the new light source, right? It's a little bit softer, tends to be a little bit softer than the open face light. So it is a trade-off. You lose a little bit of light. It's not quite as hard. However, now you have this great flexible and versatile thing that can focus and flood, right? So that's a nice benefit. So I would recommend Fresnel lights and no more than 1,000-watt lights. So you're not having to deal with power stuff and electrical hazards and like breakers and stuff, which is something you may or may not be ready to deal with, though it is something you should educate yourself about. I'll get into that a little bit more in a couple minutes. But so I'd recommend maybe get like a 500-watt. A used Mole Richardson lights are going to be pretty cheap. You get like a 500-watt and a 1,000-watt Mole Richardson tungsten Fresnel, and those are going to be a pretty versatile light. You can do a lot of things with them, with the caveats that I mentioned earlier about things you have to deal with when it comes to tungsten. So I'll talk about DIY for a second. So in principle, I think if it looks good on camera, then it's good. So anything that you can use that's DIY, work lights, flashlights, lamps, like household lamps, floodlights from Home Depot, like anything really. If it looks good, you're good. Use what you have at your disposal. There's nothing wrong with that. Definitely have been plenty of times when I've used work lights and stuff like that. And they're really cheap, right? And you can borrow them and stuff. So yeah, definitely use those. Okay, so I've covered cameras, I've covered lights. It was a lot of information. I'm just going to cover a couple other things really briefly because I think you're probably wondering if you're looking at buying your first camera and your first set of lights, you're probably wondering about lenses and audio, camera support, and a few other things. So first, lenses. Generally speaking, I'd recommend that you either get some fixed focal length lenses, prime lenses, or a zoom lens that covers a similar range of something like 24 millimeter, 50 millimeter, and 75 or 85 millimeter. Yes, this is all subject to preference, but generally speaking, this is an understood number of focal lengths, or like understood focal lengths that will cover you under most circumstances. Pretty much, it gives you a nice wide, it gives you a nice close-up lens, and nice telephoto lens. So yeah. Audio, I would say find someone who's newer, find someone who's looking to get into audio, team up with them, build a relationship with them, and hire them at a rate that works for you and works for them. So you just have audio covered and you don't have to worry about it. Because the last thing you want is to have audio turn out really bad on your film, and now it's like kind of ruins your project. Another thing that you can do is buy a cheap boom pole, XLR cable, and boom mic, and run that sucker right into the camera, or get a used H4n Zoom recorder and plug that boom into that and just have someone run boom. That's what we did on my first movie. I boomed like half the movie. So it's definitely doable. Next thing is camera support. So camera support, the number one thing I'd recommend is ignore gimbals and glide cams and dollies and sliders and all this stuff. Just get a tripod that will get the job done. Number one thing that you're going to want is a tripod. You can just get something that will do the trick. It doesn't need to be fancy. Tripods can get quite expensive. So I did a little bit of research and I found something that I think is a decent fluid head tripod that pans and tilts smoothly. And that is the Small Rig AD01, which is $160. So great deal, has great reviews, and it seems like a good first tripod. So next I'll cover safety and power, and they kind of go hand in hand. And I'll try and simplify this as much as possible. Safety, I would just say go on Amazon, buy a 6-pack of fillable sandbags, fill those suckers up, and just get in the habit of sandbagging your lights. Because especially with those lightweight aluminum light stands, they're just so light and delicate and they get knocked over really easily. And you just don't want your lights to get knocked over and either like ruin a shot because light got bumped, or knock over a light and break it and ruin your shot, or whatever. You have to buy new stuff, or to hurt somebody. You definitely don't want that. A light landing, hitting somebody, hitting them on the head, landing on someone and it's a hot light and it burns them, because those things get really hot. Really, you could definitely get third degree burns with those things. So just avoid that and get in the habit of sandbagging your lights. It's the right thing to do. It's the professional thing to do, and your crew and your cast will appreciate it for you being considerate. On power, generally speaking, the just normal household electrical cables you get from the Home Depot or Walmart or whatever, those are fine. I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty on this stuff, but just understand that those cables are rated for a certain amount of power throughput. They're rated for like 15 amps, the normal ones. So 15 amps, the math doesn't work out exactly like this, but a good rule of thumb for doing the math in your head is lights are rated in wattage. So if you have 1500 watts of lights, that's roughly 15 amps. So that's a max you want to run through combined on one power cord. So all the things that are plugged into that cord running into the wall shouldn't be more than 15 amps, or roughly 1500 watts. And the same goes for household outlets. Like there's a limit before you start popping breakers. And some places it's 15 amps. Newer places it's 15 or 20 amps. And I feel like, at least where I live, they tend to be 20 amps. But yeah, you just want to run with a margin of error, because what's going to happen is someone is going to plug in a hair dryer or a toaster or a microwave or whatever. And they're like, why is this microwave unplugged? I need to heat up my tea. And they stick it in the thing, and now all the lights go off, and your scene is like you were in the middle of filming a scene or something. So yeah. And what happens with those power cords is that when you're running more than 15 amps continuously through one, they're rated for that because they get really, really hot. They heat up and the rubber and the plastic melts, and then it becomes an electrical fire hazard. So that's why they're rated that way. Well, anyway, I could go in a lot more detail on that. There's really a lot to share, and I've learned so much over the years. It's just crazy, and I continue to learn every day. I would say, just as a way to wrap up, that I want to reiterate what I said at the beginning, which is don't get caught up in this. They call it a gear acquisition syndrome, GAS. I've had gas before. Don't have gas. Don't get fixated on the equipment. You just want the bare minimum, right? Like in business, in entrepreneurship, there's this principle called minimum viable product. Like it's just enough to get the job done, to demonstrate, or to like get to the next level, right? That's what you're doing with this equipment. You're not trying to get cinema level equipment. You're trying to learn your craft, and you're trying to master your craft. So just get the minimum level of equipment that you need to do that. Another thing that I recommend is don't rely only on what you have. Go network, go connect with other people who are already doing what you want to be doing, or who have something that you can learn from them. Offer something valuable, or just ask them like, hey, can I shadow you? Hey, can I come help you out on set? I'd like to learn from you. and just get out there, immerse yourself in film sets in the filmmaking environment, and learn as much as you can and soak it up. You might get an opportunity to get your hands on equipment and learn things that you wouldn't if you were just doing your own thing. And that's definitely been my experience. So yeah, don't get too caught up in the equipment and be spending tons and tons of money. Like I told you at the beginning, the first camera we bought was $5,000 camera. That doesn't even include the lens. Our lights that we bought were like $3,500. Granted, the equipment was more expensive back then, so I have to grant myself that. But I think we could have spent less money. And if I just would have known where to look, I think I could have done that. So my hope for you watching this is that you are able to walk away with some valuable information and a little bit of guidance so you can take that next step and hopefully not spend too much money while doing so. So thank you very much for watching. If you're watching this on YouTube or listening wherever you listen to podcasts, I definitely appreciate it. I hope this was valuable for you. And please give us a subscribe on YouTube or follow on the podcast platform of your choice if you're listening, so that you can get updated when I do release the next episode. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time.